The stagecoach door swung open, and Josephine Mercer stepped into what should have been her new life. Instead, she found herself staring at the back of a man walking away, the man who was supposed to be her husband. Theodore Ashford didn't even have the decency to wait until they were alone. Right there, in front of the general store, in front of God and half the town, he looked her up and down with disgust and said 5 words that would echo in her nightmares: "You're not what I ordered." Then he was gone, leaving her with $8, a battered trunk, and the sound of whispered laughter cutting through the autumn air like knives. If you want to know how a woman survives when the world tells her she's unwanted, stay with me until the end of this story. And please, hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see how far Joe's journey reaches across the world. The rain started as a whisper, then became a roar. Josephine stood frozen on the wooden sidewalk, her traveling dress already soaked through, her carefully pinned hair coming loose in wet strands that stuck to her cheeks. The townspeople of Bitter Creek, Wyoming Territory, had seen enough. One by one, they turned away, hurrying into shops and homes, leaving her alone with her humiliation and the growing puddles at her feet. She'd known this was a risk. Mail-order brides were always a gamble, for both parties. But she'd been so careful with her letters to Theodore. So honest about everything except the one thing that apparently mattered most to him. She described herself as sturdy and capable. She'd mentioned her love of cooking and her skill with a needle. She'd even been brave enough to hint that she carried a little extra weight, writing that she was a woman of substance, built for the hardships of frontier life. Apparently, Theodore Ashford had read substance and pictured someone entirely different. "Miss?" A thin voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. "You can't stand there all day. You're blocking the entrance." Joe turned to see the general store clerk, a pinch-faced woman with steel-gray hair pulled back so tight it seemed to lift her eyebrows. The woman's expression was somewhere between pity and annoyance, landing squarely on inconvenience. "I'm sorry, Joe's voice cracked. She swallowed hard, forcing steel into her spine. She'd cried enough on the 3-week journey from Ohio. She wouldn't give these people the satisfaction of seeing her break. "I need to find lodging. Is there a boarding house in town?" The woman's lips pursed. "Mrs. Hartley runs a respectable establishment on 3rd Street. But she don't take charity cases, and I heard what happened with Theodore." "You got money?" Joe's hand instinctively went to the small purse hanging from her wrist. $8. Everything she had in the world, minus the trunk full of clothes she'd sewn herself and the hope that now seemed laughable. "I can pay, The woman didn't sound convinced. "Mrs. Hartley charges 50 cents a night, meals extra. You might want to think about the return fare to wherever you came from." The return fare. As if Joe had anywhere to return to. Her father had died 2 years ago, leaving debts that swallowed their small farm. Her stepmother had made it clear there was no room for Joe in her new life with her new husband. Joe's 2 younger stepsisters had already found matches, pretty girls with tiny waists and sweet dispositions. Joe, at 26, with her round face and rounder hips, had been the leftover daughter nobody wanted, until Theodore's letters had arrived, full of promises about a new start in the West. Where a man valued a woman's character over her silhouette. What a fool she'd been. "Thank you for the information," Joe said quietly, and began wrestling her trunk across the muddy street. It was heavier than she remembered. Or maybe she was just tired. Bone tired. Soul tired. The kind of tired that came from years of being looked at and found wanting, from being the girl boys danced with on a dare, from being the woman shopkeepers assumed couldn't afford the nice fabrics even though she had the money saved. She made it halfway across the street before her boot caught in the mud and she stumbled. The trunk tipped, spilling open, and suddenly her underthings were floating in a puddle. Her carefully folded dresses soaking up dirty water, her mother's quilt, the only thing she had left of her real mother, dragging through the muck. No. Joe fell to her knees, not caring about her dress anymore, grabbing frantically at her belongings. Tears mixed with rain on her face as she clutched the quilt to her chest. A group of men outside the saloon laughed, and she heard one of them say something about beached whales. She was shaking now, from cold and rage and shame. This was it. This was as low as a person could sink. Kneeling in the mud of a strange town, clutching her dead mother's quilt, while strangers laughed at her pain, here, the voice was so quiet she almost missed it. Joe looked up to find a man standing over her, holding out a large, calloused hand. He was tall, over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same rough stone as the mountains surrounding the town. A scar ran from his left eyebrow down to his jaw, pulling his mouth into a slight, permanent grimace. His dark hair was too long, touching his collar, and his clothes were clean but worn, mended in several places, but it was his eyes that caught her. Dark brown, almost black, and filled with something she recognized because she felt it in her own chest, anger at the world's cruelty. He gestured again with his hand, and Joe realized he was offering to help her up. She hesitated. She'd learned that accepting help from men usually came with a price, but the rain was coming down harder now, and her fingers were going numb. She placed her hand in his, and he pulled her to her feet with surprising gentleness. For a moment, they stood there, hands clasped, studying each other. Up close, she could see the scars weren't just on his face. They ran down his neck and disappeared under his collar. Old burns, she realized. The kind that spoke of a fire that had nearly claimed him. He released her hand and knelt to gather her scattered belongings. His movements were efficient, methodical, showing no embarrassment at handling her intimate garments. He repacked her trunk with more care than she'd expected. Then lifted it as if it weighed nothing. Joe opened her mouth to thank him, but he was already walking away, carrying her trunk toward the far end of town. She hurried after him, her skirts heavy with mud and water. "Sir. Sir, wait. Where are you?" He turned, and she saw him reach into his coat pocket. For a terrifying moment, she thought he might be reaching for a weapon, but instead, he pulled out a small slate and a piece of chalk. He wrote quickly, his handwriting surprisingly neat. "Boarding house, understanding dawned." He couldn't speak. "Oh. Thank you." Joe felt her cheeks flush. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize." He shook his head, dismissing her apology, and continued walking. Joe followed, no longer sure what else to do. The stranger seemed to know where he was going, and she was too exhausted to argue. Besides, what were her options? Stand in the rain until she drowned? Go back to the general store and face that pinch-faced woman's judgment? They walked in silence through the muddy streets. Bitter Creek was smaller than Joe had imagined from Theodore's letters. One main street with perhaps 20 buildings, a general store, saloon, bank, church, blacksmith, and various other businesses she couldn't identify through the rain. Beyond the town, she could see rolling hills covered in scrub grass, and further still, mountains that disappeared into low-hanging clouds. The boarding house was a 2-story structure that had once been painted white but was now a dingy gray. A hand-painted sign declared it Hartley's Respectable Lodging for Ladies. The stranger set down Joe's trunk on the covered porch and knocked. The woman who answered was exactly what Joe expected: gray hair, stern face, eyes that assessed and judged in a single sweeping glance. "Marcus Dawson. What brings you to town?" "And who's this?" "Marcus," so that was his name, wrote on his slate. "She needs a room." Mrs. Hartley's eyes narrowed. "Does she now?" "And who's paying?" "I am," Joe said quickly, stepping forward. "I can pay 50 cents a night," your clerk said. "That's right. In advance. And no gentlemen callers, no drinking, no profanity, and breakfast is at 6 sharp. Miss it, and you don't eat." Mrs. Hartley held out her hand expectantly. Joe fumbled with her purse, pulling out 2 quarters. As she handed them over, she saw Mrs. Hartley's expression shift from stern to calculating. "You're that mail-order bride Theodore refused, aren't you? The one who, well, The older woman's pause said everything her words didn't. Joe lifted her chin. I am Josephine Mercer from Marietta, Ohio. And yes, Mr. Ashford decided our arrangement wouldn't suit. Now, may I have my room, please? For a moment, she thought Mrs. Hartley might refuse. But the woman pocketed the coins and stepped aside. Room 3, top of the stairs. Supper's at 6 if you want to pay extra for it. 25 cents. Joe nodded and reached for her trunk, but Marcus was already carrying it inside. He climbed the stairs with ease despite his pronounced limp. The right leg, she noticed, didn't quite bend normally. Old injury, probably from the same incident that had scarred his face and throat. Room 3 was small but clean. A narrow bed with a thin quilt, a washstand with a chipped basin, a single chair, and a window that looked out over the muddy street. Marcus set the trunk at the foot of the bed and turned to leave. Wait, Joe said. Please. I need to thank you properly. You didn't have to help me. Most people. She gestured vaguely toward the window, toward the town that had watched her humiliation with either amusement or indifference. Most people didn't. Marcus studied her for a long moment, then wrote on his slate, "They're fools." Something in Joe's chest cracked open. She'd been holding herself together through sheer force of will, but those two simple words, written in chalk by a scarred stranger, nearly undid her. She blinked rapidly, refusing to cry. "Are you always this kind to strangers?" she asked. He shook his head and wrote, "Only the ones who need it." Then he did something unexpected. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out $3 silver. He set them on the washstand and was out the door before Joe could protest. "Wait. I can't take your money." "Sir, Marcus, please," but he was already gone, his uneven footsteps echoing down the stairs. Joe stood in the middle of the small room, staring at the $3. Combined with her remaining 6, she had enough for nearly 3 weeks of room and board. 3 weeks to figure out what came next. 3 weeks to decide if she had the strength to start over in a town that had already decided she wasn't worth their kindness. She sank onto the bed and finally let herself cry. Underscore 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 underscore. That night, Joe lay awake listening to the rain hammer against the window and the sounds of Bitter Creek settling in for the night. Somewhere, a dog barked. A woman laughed in the distance. A horse whinnied at the livery stable. Supper had been a quiet, awkward affair. Mrs. Hartley ran a tight dining room. 3 other boarders, all women, all carefully not staring at Joe while obviously discussing her in whispers. Joe had eaten her stew and cornbread in silence, then retreated to her room. Now, in the darkness, she had to face the truth. She had maybe 3 weeks before she was destitute. Theodore Ashford owned the bank. He'd made it clear she wasn't welcome. Who would hire her? The general store clerk had already marked her as charity case. Mrs. Hartley tolerated her only because her money was as good as anyone else's. Joe had few skills that translated to frontier town employment. She could cook, but the boarding house had a cook. She could sew, but how many people in Bitter Creek needed fine needlework? She could read and cipher, but she wasn't educated enough to be a teacher. She could clean. She could organize. She could manage a household, but nobody wanted a housekeeper who looked like her. She'd learned that back in Ohio when she tried to find work after her father died. The wealthy families wanted slender, pretty girls who wouldn't tempt their husbands. The working families couldn't afford help at all. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and Joe pulled the thin quilt tighter around her shoulders. Tomorrow, she'd start looking for work. She'd go door to door if she had to. She'd prove to Theodore Ashford and this whole damn town that she was more than her appearance. She had to. because the alternative, returning to Ohio in defeat, admitting that she'd failed, becoming a burden on her stepmother's grudging charity, was worse than anything Bitter Creek could throw at her. Almost anything. Underscore 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 underscore. Morning came too early. Mrs. Hartley's breakfast bell rang at precisely 6 o'clock, and Jo dragged herself from bed with muscles that ached from yesterday's humiliation. She'd spent half the night trying to salvage her clothes, hanging the wet dresses by the window and sponging mud from her boots. The other boarders were already seated when Jo entered the dining room. They fell silent as she took her place at the end of the table, a stout woman of about 40, a thin girl who couldn't be more than 16, and an older lady with kind eyes who offered Jo a small smile. "Miss Mercer, isn't it?" the older woman said. "I'm Mrs. Patterson. This is Mrs. Howell and her daughter, Grace. Pleased to meet you," Jo said quietly. Mrs. Howell sniffed and turned her attention to her porridge. Grace stared at Jo with wide, curious eyes until her mother elbowed her sharply. Mrs. Hartley appeared with a pot of coffee and a plate of biscuits. "I run a respectable house," she announced to no one in particular. "What happened yesterday in the street was unfortunate, but it's got nothing to do with me. Miss Mercer pays her way same as everyone else, and I expect you all to treat each other with Christian courtesy." It was perhaps the kindest thing anyone in Bitter Creek had said to Jo, even if it was delivered in Mrs. Hartley's usual stern tone. "Thank you," Jo murmured. Breakfast was porridge, biscuits with butter, and weak coffee. Jo ate mechanically, already planning her day. She'd start with the general store, maybe they needed help with inventory or cleaning. Then the saloon might need a cook or washerwoman. The church would have a parson who might know of families needing assistance. She was so lost in thought that she didn't notice the commotion outside until Mrs. Patterson gasped and pointed toward the window. "Goodness! Isn't that Marcus Dawson's wagon?" Jo turned to look. Sure enough, a weathered buckboard wagon was pulled up in front of the boarding house, and Marcus himself was climbing down from the driver's seat. He moved with the careful precision of someone whose body didn't work quite right, favoring his good leg. "What's he want?" Mrs. Howell demanded. "He never comes to town except for supplies, and he got those yesterday." Mrs. Hartley appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "Marcus Dawson to see Miss Mercer," she called out. "Jo, you got a visitor." Every eye in the room turned to Jo. She felt her face flush hot. I don't know why he'd." She stood up, nearly knocking over her coffee cup. "Excuse me," Marcus was waiting on the porch, slate in hand. He'd cleaned up since yesterday, his hair was combed, his shirt was fresh, and he'd shaved the stubble from his jaw. When he saw Jo, he touched the brim of his hat in greeting and held out the slate. "I have a proposition." Jo's heart sank. She'd heard that word before from men, and it never meant anything good. "I'm not interested in that kind of." Marcus shook his head vigorously and erased the slate, writing quickly, "Not that." A job." Jo's voice came out higher than intended. Behind her, she could feel the other boarders pressing closer to the window, shamelessly eavesdropping. Marcus nodded and gestured toward his wagon. He wrote again, "Come to my ranch. We talk there." Private. Every instinct Jo had screamed that this was a terrible idea. She didn't know this man. For all his kindness yesterday, he was still a stranger asking her to go somewhere isolated with him. But those same instincts had told her to trust Theodore's letters, and look where that had gotten her. Besides, what choice did she have? She needed work, and Marcus was offering it. "All right," she said. "But if this is some kind of trick," he wrote, "I give you my word. Honorable offer only." There was something in his eyes, that same recognition she'd seen yesterday, the understanding of what it meant to be judged unfairly. that made her trust him despite her better judgment. "Let me get my shawl." The ride out to Marcus's ranch took nearly an hour. They traveled in silence, following a rutted road that wound through scrub grass and patches of wildflowers. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained gray and threatening. Marcus drove with competent ease, one hand on the reins, his eyes scanning the horizon. Joe studied him covertly. Up close, in daylight, she could see he was probably in his early 30s. The burn scars were extensive, covering most of the left side of his face and neck. His hands bore similar marks, shiny, puckered skin that spoke of terrible pain, long endured. Whatever had happened to him had been catastrophic, but his eyes held something gentle beneath the wariness. She'd seen how carefully he'd repacked her trunk, how he'd left her money without expecting thanks, how he'd driven all the way back to town just to offer her work, unless this was all an elaborate con. Unless he was one of those men who preyed on desperate women. Joe's hand slipped into her pocket, closing around the small knife she always carried. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was something. As if sensing her tension, Marcus glanced at her and offered what might have been a reassuring smile, though the scars made it hard to tell. He pulled a canteen from beneath the seat and offered it to her. She hesitated, then took it. The water was clean and cold. She drank gratefully and handed it back. They crested a hill, and suddenly she could see it, a ranch house nestled in a valley, with a barn, corral, and several outbuildings scattered around it. The house itself was larger than she'd expected, 2 stories with a wide porch. Or it had been, once. Now she could see broken shutters, a sagging porch rail, and what looked like years of neglect. Marcus pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and jumped down, then came around to help Joe. His hand was steady as she climbed down. And he released her immediately, as if aware that she might bolt at any moment. He led her up the porch steps, which creaked alarmingly, and opened the front door. The smell hit her first. Dust, neglect, and sadness, all mixed together. The entry hall was dim, heavy curtains blocking most of the light. As her eyes adjusted, Joe could make out furniture covered in dust sheets, cobwebs in the corners, and a general air of abandonment. Marcus struck a match and lit a lamp, then handed Joe his slate. "My brother's house. He died 3 years ago. Fire. I lived after." "Barely, so that explained the scars." Joe's heart clenched with unexpected sympathy. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Marcus nodded and continued writing. "I live here now. With my nephew. Boy is 7. Needs woman's care. House needs woman's care. I can't do both." "Your nephew," Joe repeated. "Where is he now?" "Hiding," Marcus wrote with what might have been a rueful expression. "Scared of strangers, and you want me to, what, exactly? Be a housekeeper?" "A governess," Marcus erased and wrote carefully. "Both. Also cook. Clean. Teach Tommy. Help with ranch work if you can. I pay room, board, and $5 a month. $5 a month." It wasn't much, but it was more than Joe had. And room and board meant she wouldn't have to spend her precious savings at Mrs. Hartley's. "Why me?" she asked. "You don't know anything about me," Marcus wrote. "I know you didn't deserve what Theodore did. I know you kept your dignity when others would have broken. I know you're strong." That's enough. Joe felt tears prick her eyes again. When was the last time someone had called her strong? When was the last time someone had looked at her and seen something other than her weight? "Can I see the rest of the house?" she asked. Marcus nodded and gave her a tour. The house was even worse than the entry hall suggested. The kitchen was a disaster, dirty dishes piled in the sink, food gone bad on the counter, mouse droppings in the pantry. The parlor looked like it hadn't been touched since the day Marcus's brother died, a child's toy still sitting on the floor, a woman's shawl draped over a chair. Upstairs, there were 4 bedrooms. One clearly belonged to Marcus, a Spartan space with a narrow bed and few personal belongings. Another was Tommy's, clothes scattered everywhere, bed unmade, drawings tacked to the walls. The third was empty except for more dust sheets. The fourth, this was your brother and his wife's room, Joe said quietly. Marcus nodded. He wrote, haven't been able to clean it. Too many memories, Joe understood. After her father died, it had taken her months to go through his things. And she'd only been dealing with grief, not the added trauma of surviving the fire that killed him. Mr. Dawson, Marcus, I appreciate the offer, I truly do. But I need to know. Is this arrangement purely professional? Because if you're expecting, he held up his hand, stopping her mid-sentence, and wrote firmly, professional only. You'd have your own room. Lock on door. My word as a man, all right then, Joe heard herself say. I accept. Marcus's shoulders relaxed visibly. He wrote, you can start today. Joe thought of her few belongings back at the boarding house, of Mrs. Hartley's stern face and the whispers of the other boarders. She thought of Theodore Ashford walking away from her in the rain. She thought of having nowhere else to go and nothing else to lose. I can start right now, she said. But first, I'd like to meet Tommy. Marcus led Joe down the stairs and through the kitchen to the back door. Beyond it, she could see the barn, a large structure that had weathered better than the house. He pointed toward it and wrote on his slate, in the loft. Give him time. Joe nodded and watched as Marcus walked across the muddy yard with his uneven gait. He disappeared into the barn, and she waited, hands clasped in front of her, trying to calm the nervous flutter in her stomach. She'd never been particularly good with children. Her stepsisters had been raised mostly by their mother, and Joe had been too busy trying to keep the farm running after her father's death to spend much time with them. After what felt like an eternity, a small face appeared in the barn's upper window. Dark eyes peered out at her. Suspicious and afraid. Joe raised her hand in a tentative wave. The face disappeared. Marcus emerged a few minutes later, shaking his head. He wrote, needs more time. He's been through a lot, I understand, Joe said. His parents died in a fire. Marcus nodded, his expression growing darker. He wrote, my brother Robert and his wife Catherine. Tommy was visiting neighbors that night. Only reason he survived, and you've been caring for him since then, trying to, Marcus wrote. Not very good at it. He needs better. Joe looked back at the barn, at that window where a frightened child was hiding. She thought about being 7 years old and losing everything. She thought about what it must be like to live with an uncle who couldn't speak. In a house full of ghosts and dust and silence, he needs stability, she said softly. Routine. A clean home. Good meals. Someone who won't leave him. Marcus studied her face for a long moment, then wrote, that's why you're here. Joe took a deep breath. Then I'd better get started. Do you have cleaning supplies? What followed was a blur of activity that would have horrified Mrs. Hartley's sense of propriety. Joe tied up her skirts, rolled up her sleeves, and dove into the mess with a determination born of desperation and purpose. If she was going to make this work, if she was going to earn her keep and prove her worth, she needed to transform this house from a tomb into a home. Marcus watched her for a few minutes with something like wonder in his eyes, then grabbed a bucket and joined her. They started with the kitchen because, as Joe explained, everything started with the kitchen. A family couldn't function without a clean place to prepare food, and she'd be damned if she was going to cook in that disaster. Marcus hauled water from the well while Joe scrubbed. She threw out food that had gone rancid, scoured the dishes until they gleamed, swept mouse droppings and dust into piles that Marcus carried outside. The work was hard and dirty, but Joe found herself settling into a rhythm. This, at least, was something she knew how to do. This was a problem she could solve with elbow grease and determination. Around midday, Marcus tapped her shoulder and pointed toward the barn. Tommy stood in the doorway, watching them with those dark, wary eyes. Hello, Tommy, Joe called out, keeping her voice gentle. Are you hungry? I found some eggs in the henhouse and some potatoes that are still good. I could make lunch if you'd like." The boy didn't respond, but he didn't run away either. Jo took that as progress. She cooked while Marcus continued cleaning, making a simple meal of fried eggs, boiled potatoes, and biscuits from the stores she'd found in the pantry. The pantry itself was a disgrace: half-empty sacks of flour, sugar with weevils, coffee that had gone stale. She made a mental list of what they'd need from town. When the food was ready, she set 3 plates at the kitchen table, which she'd scrubbed clean. Marcus washed his hands at the pump and sat down, gesturing for Jo to do the same. They waited. After a few minutes, Tommy crept in through the back door. He was a small boy for 7, with his uncle's dark hair and his mother's delicate features. His clothes were too small, his face smudged with dirt, his hands clutching a carved wooden horse. "There's plenty," Jo said quietly. "And I promise I'm a decent cook." Not fancy, but filling. Tommy slid into his chair, never taking his eyes off her. He picked up his fork and stabbed an egg, bringing it to his mouth. After the first bite, he ate with the desperate hunger of a child who'd been living on whatever scraps he could find. Jo's heart broke a little. She glanced at Marcus, who was watching his nephew with an expression of such profound sadness that she had to look away. They ate in silence. When Tommy finished, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and whispered, "Thank you, ma'am, you're very welcome, Tommy. And you can call me Miss Jo, if you'd like." The boy nodded and fled back to the barn, clutching his wooden horse like a talisman. "That's a start," Jo said, more to herself than to Marcus. He wrote on his slate, "More than I've gotten in weeks." The afternoon stretched into evening as they continued working. Jo moved through the house like a woman possessed, opening windows to let in fresh air, beating rugs, washing curtains. Marcus followed her lead, moving furniture, hauling trash, fixing the broken shutter on the parlor window. When they reached the room that had belonged to Tommy's parents, Jo paused. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, she could see a woman's dresses still hanging in the wardrobe, a man's boots by the bed. "Marcus," she said gently, "we don't have to do this today. Or even this week." But eventually, he nodded and wrote, "I know. Just not yet, that's all right. There's plenty else to keep me busy," and there was. By the time the sun began to set, Jo had cleaned 3 bedrooms, the kitchen, and part of the parlor. Her back ached, her hands were raw. And her dress was filthy, but the house already looked different. It looked lived in again. It looked like someone cared. Marcus made a gesture toward the door, then wrote, "I'll take you back to town. Get your things." Jo looked around at all the work still to be done. She thought about the narrow bed at Mrs. Hartley's boarding house, about spending another night listening to whispers through thin walls. She thought about losing momentum, about walking away from this place and possibly not having the courage to come back. "Is there bedding for the spare room?" she asked. Marcus blinked in surprise, then nodded. "Then I'll stay tonight, if that's all right. I can get my trunk tomorrow. It's not like I have much to fetch." For a moment, Marcus just stared at her. Then he wrote, "You're sure?" "I'm sure. Besides, someone needs to make dinner, and I don't think you or Tommy have been eating properly." Something that might have been gratitude flickered across Marcus's scarred face. He nodded and headed upstairs, returning a few minutes later with sheets, a quilt, and a pillow. Together, they made up the bed in the spare room, Jo's room now, she supposed. It was smaller than the other bedrooms, with a single window that looked out over the yard and barn. The furniture was simple: a bed, a washstand, a chest of drawers, and a chair. But it was clean, and it was hers. And that was more than she'd expected to have yesterday. "Thank you," she said to Marcus. "For all of this. For giving me a chance," he wrote. "Thank you for taking it." Not many would. That night, Jo made dinner from what she could salvage in the pantry: beans with salt pork, cornbread, and stewed apples from a jar she found in the cellar. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot and filling. Tommy appeared without being called, drawn by the smell of food, and ate 2 full plates before retreating to his room. After dinner, Marcus went to check on the animals. There were chickens, 3 cows, 2 horses, and a barn cat that Tommy had apparently adopted. Joe washed the dishes, then lit a lamp and sat down at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil she'd found in a drawer. She made lists. Things they needed from town. Repairs that couldn't wait. A schedule for cleaning the rest of the house. A menu plan for the week. It was soothing, making order from chaos, creating a structure that would carry them forward. She was still writing when Marcus came back inside. He looked at her lists, then at her, and wrote, "You don't have to do everything at once." "I know," Joe said. "But it helps me think. Helps me see what's possible." He nodded slowly, then wrote, "I'll go to town tomorrow. Get supplies. Pick up your trunk, I can come with you. Help carry, no," he wrote firmly. "Stay with Tommy. He needs to get used to you. And people will talk less if you're not seen with me yet." Joe understood. In a town like Bitter Creek, a woman living with a man unchaperoned would cause scandal, never mind that their arrangement was purely professional. The longer they could keep her presence here quiet, the better. "All right," she agreed. "But I'll need money for supplies. And I should write down exactly what we need." Marcus pulled out a leather purse and counted out $15, far more than the supplies would cost. When Joe started to protest, he wrote, "You'll find other things we need. And you earned wages today. I've only been here 1 day, worth more than a month." He wrote with something that might have been a smile. Later, lying in her narrow bed and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, the wind in the eaves, the creak of old wood settling, an owl hooting in the distance, Joe felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not happiness, exactly. Not yet. But possibility. The sense that maybe, just maybe, she could build something here. Not the life she'd imagined when she'd answered Theodore's advertisement, but a life nonetheless. A life with purpose and dignity and work that mattered. She fell asleep making plans. The next morning, Joe woke before dawn to the sound of a rooster crowing. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came flooding back. The rejection, the rain, Marcus's offer, this room, this chance. She dressed quickly in one of her work dresses and went downstairs to find Marcus already in the kitchen, making coffee. He looked startled to see her so early, and wrote, "You should rest. Plenty of time to rest when I'm dead," Joe said briskly. "Besides, I need to get breakfast started before you leave for town. Can't have you and Tommy eating cold beans again." She shooed him out of the kitchen and took over, making porridge with raisins, frying bacon, mixing up a batch of Johnny cakes. By the time she called them to the table, she had a proper breakfast laid out. Tommy came down the stairs rubbing his eyes, his hair sticking up in all directions. He looked at the food, then at Joe, then at Marcus with an expression that clearly asked if this was real. Marcus nodded and gestured for the boy to sit. They ate together as the sun rose, painting the kitchen in shades of gold and amber. Joe watched Tommy put away more food than seemed possible for his small frame and realized the child had probably been half-starved. Marcus noticed too, she could see it in the tight set of his jaw, the way his hands clenched around his coffee cup. He blamed himself, she realized, for not being able to care for his nephew properly. For being trapped in his own grief and limitations. After breakfast, Marcus hitched up the wagon and prepared to leave for town. He handed Joe the list she'd made the night before, along with the leather purse. Before he climbed up to the driver's seat, he wrote, "If Tommy asks about his parents, tell him the truth. Don't lie to make it easier." Joe nodded, throat tight. "I won't. I promise." Marcus studied her face for a long moment, as if committing it to memory, then touched the brim of his hat and drove away, and then it was just Joe and Tommy. The boy had disappeared into the barn again, so Joe gave him space and returned to her work. She tackled the parlor next, pulling down the heavy curtains and dragging them outside to beat the dust from them. The room beneath was beautiful, or it had been, once. Tall windows, a stone fireplace, built-in bookshelves that still held a collection of well-worn volumes. A piano sat in the corner, covered in dust, its keys yellowed with age. Jo ran her fingers over the piano keys, producing a discordant sound. She'd never learned to play, such luxuries hadn't been available to her, but Catherine Dawson had clearly been an educated woman. There were music books stacked on the piano bench, a sampler on the wall with careful stitching, photographs in silver frames showing a happy family. She picked up one of the photographs. A young couple with a baby. The man had Marcus's eyes and strong jaw, but his face was unmarred by scars. The woman was pretty, with soft features and kind eyes. And the baby, Tommy, she realized, was laughing, his small hands reaching for his mother's face. That's my mama and papa. Jo nearly dropped the photograph. She turned to find Tommy standing in the doorway, the wooden horse still clutched in one hand. They're beautiful, Jo said softly. You look just like your mother. Tommy came closer, his bare feet making no sound on the dusty floor. Uncle Marcus says Mama was the best lady in the whole world. She could play the piano and sing and make apple pie. And Papa was strong. He could lift a whole hay bale by himself. I'm sure they were wonderful people. They died in the fire. Tommy's voice was matter-of-fact, but his eyes held a terrible knowledge. I was at the Hendersons' house for supper. When I came home, everything was burning. People tried to save them, but it was too hot. Jo knelt down so she was eye level with the boy. I'm so sorry, Tommy. That must have been terribly frightening. Uncle Marcus went into the fire anyway. He went in to try to find them even though everyone yelled at him to stop. He came out all burned, and they were already dead. Tommy's lower lip trembled. And now he can't talk because the smoke hurt his throat, and it's all my fault because if I'd been home instead of at the Hendersons. Maybe I could have woken them up. Oh, sweetheart, no. Jo reached out instinctively, then stopped, unsure if the boy would accept comfort from a stranger. But Tommy surprised her by stepping into her arms, and she held him while he cried, deep, wrenching sobs that had probably been building for 3 years. It wasn't your fault, she murmured into his hair. Fires happen. Terrible things happen. But it wasn't because of anything you did or didn't do. Your uncle loves you very much. He'd never want you to blame yourself. They stayed like that for a long time, Jo holding this broken child while he released years of guilt and grief. When he finally pulled away, his face was red and splotchy. But something in his eyes looked lighter. Miss Jo, he said in a small voice. Are you going to stay? Or are you going to leave like the other ladies? Other ladies, Tommy nodded. Uncle Marcus tried to hire help before. 3 times. They all left. Mrs. Cooper said the house was too dirty. Miss Evans said Uncle Marcus was scary looking. And Mrs. Foster said I was a wild child who needed a firm hand. He said the last part with clear bitterness. Jo felt anger kindle in her chest. What kind of people abandoned a traumatized child and a grieving man because things weren't perfect? What kind of people valued appearance over character? I'm going to stay, Tommy, she said firmly. I promise you that. Your uncle gave me a job, and I don't break my promises. The house will get clean because we'll clean it together. Your uncle isn't scary, he's brave. And you're not wild, you're hurt. But we're going to fix that. All of it. Together. Tommy's eyes widened. Really, really. But I'll need your help. Think you can show me where your mother kept her recipe books? I'd like to learn how to make that apple pie you mentioned. For the first time since Jo had met him, Tommy smiled. It was a small, tentative thing, but it transformed his face. I can show you. And I know where Mama kept her garden seeds too. She grew the best tomatoes, then let's go find them. They spent the rest of the morning together, Tommy gradually opening up as they worked. He showed Joe where Catherine had kept her recipes, a small wooden box filled with cards in neat handwriting. He led her to the cellar, where jars of preserved fruits and vegetables lined the shelves, some of them going back to before the fire. He brought her to what had been his mother's sewing room, now a dusty shrine with fabric still stacked on the table and a half-finished dress on the dress form. "Mama was making that for me," Tommy said quietly. "For my 6th birthday. She never got to finish it." Joe looked at the small shirt, pieced together with careful stitches. "Would you like me to finish it for you? It might be a bit small now. But I could adjust the pattern." Tommy's eyes went wide. "You can sew like Mama?" "I can sew," Joe said. "Maybe not exactly like your mama, but I'll do my best." "Yes, please." So Joe added it to her growing list of tasks. Finish Tommy's birthday shirt. Plant a garden. Learn Catherine's recipes. Slowly, piece by piece, bring life back to this house. They made lunch together. Tommy proved surprisingly helpful in the kitchen once he understood Joe wasn't going to yell at him for making a mess. He chattered as they worked, telling her about the barn cat, named Whiskers, the chickens, each of which apparently had a name, and the horse he wanted to learn to ride, a gentle mare named Daisy. "Does your uncle teach you letters?" Joe asked as they sat down to eat. Tommy shook his head. "He tries, but it's hard 'cause he can't say the sounds. And I can't read what he writes on his slate because the letters are too fancy." Joe filed that information away. She'd need to work with Tommy on his reading and writing. The boy was bright, but without proper education, he'd struggle. After lunch, while Tommy fed the chickens, Joe returned to the parlor. She'd been thinking about those music books on the piano bench. She might not know how to play, but she could read, and music was just another kind of language. She opened one of the books and studied the notes. Simple songs, the kind a mother would teach a child. Mary Had a Little Lamb. Old Dan Tucker. Oh. Susanna. She picked out the melody for "Oh." Susanna, on the piano keys, wincing at the out-of-tune sound. "The piano needs tuning," Tommy said from behind her. "Mama used to have a man come from Cheyenne once a year." "Well, that's something we can think about later," Joe said. "For now, do you remember any of the songs your mother taught you?" Tommy climbed onto the bench beside her. "She was teaching me this one." He hummed a melody that Joe recognized as Shenandoah. "That's beautiful. Your mother had good taste." They spent the afternoon like that, Joe picking out simple tunes while Tommy hummed or sang along in his high, clear voice. It was healing, somehow, filling the silent house with music again, chasing away the ghosts with sound and life. When Marcus returned as the sun was setting, his wagon laden with supplies, he found them in the kitchen. Joe was making dinner while Tommy set the table, both of them singing "Oh." Susanna, at the top of their lungs. Marcus stood in the doorway for a long moment, just watching. Joe saw him there and felt her cheeks flush. "We're a bit loud," she apologized. "I hope we didn't disturb," but Marcus was already writing on his slate, and when he held it up, Joe's breath caught. He'd written just 2 words, "Thank you," that night, after Tommy had gone to bed and Marcus had brought in Joe's trunk from the wagon. They sat at the kitchen table going over the supplies. Marcus had gotten everything on her list and then some: bolts of fabric, thread in every color, a new set of pots, seeds for the garden, and a beautiful leather-bound book of fairy tales. For Tommy, Marcus wrote when Joe looked at the book questioningly. "So you can read to him. That's very thoughtful," Joe said. "He's a good boy. Bright, too. He just needs structure and attention." "How was he today?" "Better. We talked about his parents. He cried, which I think he needed to do. Then we found your sister-in-law's recipes and sewing projects. He asked me to finish a shirt she'd started for him." Marcus's hand stilled on the slate. When he wrote again, his handwriting was shakier. "You'd do that?" "Of course. It would mean a lot to him." "Why are you so kind to us?" The question caught Joe off guard. She thought about Theodore's rejection, about all the times she'd been judged and found wanting. She thought about Marcus pulling her from the mud, about the recognition in his eyes that said he understood what it meant to be cast aside. "Because someone was kind to me when I needed it most," she said simply. And because kindness shouldn't be rare, Marcus looked at her for a long moment, then reached out and squeezed her hand, just once, quick and gentle, before returning to his slate. "Tomorrow we start repairs on the porch. Then the barn roof. Winter comes early here, then I'd better get the garden planted soon." They made plans until the lamp oil ran low, then said goodnight and went to their separate rooms. Joe lay in bed, exhausted but satisfied. Her muscles ached, her hands were blistered from scrubbing, but she felt useful. Needed. For the first time since her father's death, she felt like she belonged somewhere. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Joe would wake before dawn, make breakfast, and spend the morning cleaning and organizing while Marcus worked on repairs. Tommy became her shadow, helping with small tasks and gradually learning to trust her. In the afternoons, she'd work with him on reading and writing, using Catherine's recipe cards and simple books. After dinner, she'd sew or mend while Marcus carved small wooden animals for Tommy, a growing menagerie that the boy treasured. A week passed, then two. The house transformed. Curtains were washed and rehung. Floors were scrubbed until they gleamed. The kitchen became a place of warmth and good smells, bread baking, stew simmering, pies cooling on the windowsill. Joe planted the garden, her back aching as she turned the soil, but the promise of fresh vegetables made it worthwhile. Marcus watched her work with something like awe. She'd catch him sometimes, standing in the doorway, just observing as she kneaded bread or helped Tommy with his letters. There was a gentleness in his expression that contrasted sharply with his scarred face and rough appearance, and slowly, without meaning to, Joe began to notice other things about him. The way he moved with quiet efficiency despite his limp. The care he took with Tommy, leaving small gifts, a carved bird, a smooth stone, a handful of wildflowers. The fact that he always made sure Joe had the best cut of meat at dinner, that he carried the heavy buckets without being asked, that he'd secretly bought her a new pair of work gloves when he noticed her hands were raw, she told herself it meant nothing. This was a job. A professional arrangement. Marcus was her employer, nothing more. But late at night, lying in her narrow bed, she couldn't quite convince herself that was true. The first snow came in early October, 3 weeks after Joe had arrived at the ranch. She woke to find the world transformed, a blanket of white covering everything, muffling sound, making the familiar landscape strange and beautiful. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Marcus already stoking the fire in the kitchen stove, his breath visible in the cold air. He saw her and wrote on his slate, "Early this year. Need to check on the cattle, I'll make coffee and breakfast. You'll need something hot before you go out in that." Marcus nodded and disappeared to wake Tommy. By the time they came down, Joe had porridge bubbling on the stove and coffee strong enough to strip paint. Tommy pressed his nose against the window, watching the snow fall with the wonder of a child who'd forgotten how to feel joy. "Can I go out in it, Uncle Marcus?" "Please." Marcus ruffled the boy's hair and nodded, then wrote, "After breakfast. Chores first." They ate quickly, then bundled up in layers. Marcus wore a heavy coat that had probably belonged to his brother, and he helped Tommy into a jacket that was slightly too large. When he looked at Joe in her thin shawl, his expression darkened. He disappeared upstairs and returned with a thick wool coat, Catherine's, Joe realized, but she was too cold to refuse it. Marcus headed out to check the herd while Joe and Tommy tackled the morning chores. They fed the chickens together, Tommy giggling as the birds pecked at the grain scattered in the snow. They collected eggs, fewer now that the weather had turned, and checked on the cows in the barn. Whiskers the cat wound around their ankles, meowing for attention and scraps. "Miss Joe?" Tommy said as they worked. "Are you going to leave when the snow gets too deep?" Jo paused in her milking. Why would I leave? The other ladies did. Mrs. Cooper said she couldn't be expected to work in these conditions. And Miss Evans left before the first snow even came. Well, I'm not Mrs. Cooper or Miss Evans. I made you a promise, didn't I? Tommy nodded, but doubt still lingered in his eyes. Jo understood. He'd been abandoned too many times to trust easily. Tell you what, she said. See that shirt I've been working on? Your mother's pattern. I'll have it finished by Christmas. That's 2 months away. Think I'd put all that work into a shirt just to leave before you could wear it? Tommy considered this, then smiled. No, I guess not, exactly. So stop worrying and help me with this milk. Your uncle will want coffee when he comes back. They returned to the house to find Marcus hadn't come back yet. An hour passed, then 2. Jo tried not to worry, but she kept glancing out the window at the falling snow, which was getting heavier. She made lunch and kept it warm on the stove. Tommy grew quiet, sensing her tension. Finally, as afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Marcus appeared. But he wasn't alone. He was half carrying, half dragging a cow, a young heifer who was limping badly, her front leg at an odd angle. Blood stained the snow behind them. Jo ran outside without thinking, Tommy close behind her. What happened? Marcus gestured frantically toward the barn, and together they helped him get the frightened animal inside. Once she was in a stall, Marcus collapsed against the wall, breathing hard. His face was gray with exhaustion and pain. The exertion had clearly strained his damaged leg. He pulled out his slate with shaking hands, caught in barbed wire. Leg broken. Lost blood, can you set it? Jo asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Marcus shook his head. Need vet. But storm too bad. Roads impassable. Jo looked at the heifer, who was shaking and making pitiful sounds. The break was bad. She could see the bone protruding through the skin. Without help, the animal would die, either from the wound itself or from infection. Then we'll have to do it ourselves, she heard herself say. Marcus stared at her like she'd lost her mind. He wrote, not possible. Too dangerous, more dangerous than letting her die. You said yourself the roads are impassable. Even if you could get to town, you'd freeze to death trying. And she'll be dead by morning anyway if we don't help her. Tommy tugged on Jo's sleeve. Mama used to help with the animals when they got hurt. She had books about it. Medical books. In Papa's study, Jo looked at Marcus, who was still shaking his head. But there was something in his eyes, a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, they could save this animal. Tommy, go find those books. Marcus, I need you to show me what supplies you have. And then you need to sit down before you collapse. You've pushed yourself too hard already. For a moment, she thought Marcus might argue. But then he nodded and led her to a cabinet in the back of the barn. Inside were basic veterinary supplies, bandages, bottles of medicine, a few surgical tools. Catherine had clearly been prepared for emergencies. Tommy returned with 3 leather-bound books, their pages yellowed with age. Jo flipped through them, her heart sinking. The medical terminology was beyond her, the diagrams complex. But there was a section on broken bones, with step-by-step instructions that she could follow. All right, she said, more confidently than she felt. Marcus, I need you to hold her head. Keep her calm. Tommy, you'll hand me supplies when I ask for them. Can you do that? The boy nodded solemnly, his face pale but determined. What followed was the longest hour of Jo's life. She'd helped her father with sick animals back in Ohio, but nothing like this. Working by lamplight in a freezing barn, with a terrified cow and limited supplies, she cleaned the wound, set the bone as best she could following the book's instructions, and splinted the leg with boards Marcus cut to size. Her hands were covered in blood. The cow bellowed and thrashed despite Marcus's attempts to soothe her. Tommy handed her supplies with shaking hands, his eyes wide with fear and fascination. And through it all, Joe kept talking, to the cow, to Tommy, to herself, narrating every step because if she stopped talking, she'd start thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. Finally, it was done. The leg was set and splinted, the wound bandaged. Joe had given the heifer laudanum from the medicine cabinet to ease her pain, and the animal had finally stopped struggling. She lay in the straw, breathing heavily, her eyes rolling with fear. Joe sat back on her heels, exhausted. Her dress was ruined, stained with blood and worse. Her hands trembled with reaction. But the heifer was alive, and the bleeding had stopped. Marcus touched her shoulder gently. When she looked up, his eyes were bright with emotion. He wrote, "You saved her, we saved her," Joe corrected. "All three of us." Tommy found the books. "You held her steady." "I just followed instructions, you were brave." "Miss Joe," Tommy said quietly. "Mama would have been proud." Those simple words nearly broke her. Joe blinked back tears and pulled the boy into a hug. "Your mama would be proud of you, sweetheart. You stayed calm and helped when it mattered most." They stumbled back to the house through the snow, which was now falling so heavily that Joe could barely see the porch steps. Inside, Marcus immediately went to the stove and built up the fire while Joe helped Tommy out of his wet clothes and into dry ones. Then she changed her own dress, washing the blood from her hands and arms with water Marcus heated for her. Dinner was a quiet affair. They were all too exhausted to talk, or in Marcus's case, to write. Joe made something simple, soup from yesterday's leftovers and bread. They ate mechanically, grateful for the warmth and sustenance. After Tommy had gone to bed, Joe returned to the kitchen to find Marcus still sitting at the table, staring into his coffee cup. She poured herself a cup and sat across from him. "You should rest," she said. "That leg of yours took a beating today." He waved off her concern, but she could see the lines of pain around his eyes. She stood and moved behind him, placing her hands on his shoulders. He stiffened in surprise. "Relax," she said softly. "I'm just going to work out some of the tension. My father used to get terrible aches from farm work. I learned how to help." Slowly, Marcus relaxed under her hands. She worked carefully, finding the knots in his shoulders and neck, easing them with gentle pressure. He let out a long breath, his head dropping forward. After a few minutes, he reached up and caught one of her hands, holding it gently. He pulled out his slate and wrote with his free hand. "Why did you do it?" "The cow. You could have been hurt, because it needed to be done," Joe said simply. "And because I've learned that sometimes you have to take risks. Sometimes you have to try, even when you might fail." "You weren't talking about the cow," Joe smiled despite herself. "No, I suppose I wasn't." Marcus turned in his chair to face her, still holding her hand. The lamplight cast shadows across his scarred face, but his eyes were clear and intent. He wrote, "I'm glad you came here. Glad Theodore was a fool, Marcus, I mean it. This house was dead. Tommy was dying inside. I was just existing. You brought us back to life." Joe felt tears prick her eyes. "You gave me a life when I had none. You saw worth in me when the whole world said I had none. That's not something I'll ever forget." They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped, something unspoken passing between them. Then Marcus released her hand and stood, his expression troubled. He wrote, "You should rest. Long day tomorrow. Need to check on the heifer." Joe understood the dismissal for what it was, Marcus pulling back from a line they'd almost crossed. She nodded and said goodnight, retreating to her room with her heart beating too fast. The storm lasted 3 days. Snow piled up against the house, drifting so high that they had to dig paths to the barn each morning. The world shrank to just the three of them and their small piece of land. They fell into a routine shaped by necessity, morning chores, checking on the heifer, keeping the fires burning, cooking meals, teaching Tommy, and long evenings spent together in the parlor. Joe finished Tommy's shirt and started working on winter clothes for all of them. Marcus carved more wooden animals and repaired tools. Tommy practiced his letters and learned to play simple songs on the out-of-tune piano. They read together from the fairy tale book Marcus had bought, taking turns, Joe reading aloud, Tommy following along with his finger, and Marcus listening with an expression of contentment that transformed his scarred face. The heifer, whom Tommy had named Hope, survived. Each day she grew stronger, though she'd always have a limp. Marcus checked on her constantly, and Joe could see what the animal's survival meant to him, proof that broken things could heal, that not everything had to end in loss. On the third night of the storm, Joe woke to the sound of Tommy crying. She pulled on her robe and went to his room to find him huddled under his blankets. Shaking, "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" "Bad dream," Tommy sobbed. "The fire. I dreamed I was in it this time. I couldn't get out." The smoke. Joe climbed into the narrow bed and pulled him close. "You're safe. It was just a dream. The fire can't hurt you anymore, but what if there's another fire? What if something happens to Uncle Marcus? What if, Tommy, listen to me. Bad things happen. That's true. But spending all your time worrying about what might happen means you miss the good things that are happening right now. Your uncle loves you. You're safe and warm and fed. Hope is healing. Those are the things that are real, Miss Joe." Tommy's voice was very small. "Do you think my mama and papa can see me from heaven?" Joe's throat tightened. "I think if there's a heaven, they can see you. And I think they're proud of the brave boy you're becoming. Do you think they're mad that I'm happy sometimes? That I don't cry every day anymore? Oh, sweetheart, no. They'd want you to be happy. Love doesn't end just because someone dies. They'd want you to live and grow and find joy. That's what parents want for their children." Tommy was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm glad you came here, Miss Joe. You make things better." Joe held him until he fell back asleep, then carefully extracted herself and returned to her own room. But as she passed Marcus's door, she saw light beneath it. She hesitated, then knocked softly. Marcus opened the door, fully dressed despite the late hour. His expression was questioning. "Tommy had a nightmare," Joe explained quietly. "About the fire. He's asleep now, but I thought you should know." Marcus's face crumpled with pain. He gestured for Joe to come in, then sat on the edge of his bed and began writing on his slate. "He has them often. I hear him cry but don't know how to help. Can't comfort him with words. You comfort him in other ways," Joe said, sitting in the room's single chair. "The wooden animals. The attention you pay to his needs. The fact that you're trying so hard to give him a good life. That matters, Marcus. That matters more than words. How do you always know the right thing to say?" "I don't. I just try to be honest." They talked, or rather, Joe talked and Marcus wrote, until the lamp oil ran low. They spoke about Tommy, about the ranch, about their own childhoods. Marcus told her about growing up with Robert, about the dreams they'd had of building something lasting. Joe told him about her father, about the loneliness of being the daughter nobody wanted. As dawn broke and pale light filtered through the window, Marcus wrote, "I need to tell you something." Joe's heart began to race. "What is it?" "People in town are talking. About you being here. With me. Mrs. Hartley came by last week when you were in the garden. Said it wasn't proper. Said it would cause scandal." "I see." Joe felt her stomach sink. She'd known this would happen eventually. "What do you want to do?" Marcus's hand shook as he wrote, "Don't want you to leave. But don't want to ruin your reputation. Already ruined your life enough. You haven't ruined anything. You saved me, remember? You gave me purpose when I had none. There's a solution. Marcus erased his slate and wrote carefully, "We could marry. On paper only. To stop the talk. You'd be protected. Tommy would have a mother. But it would just be an arrangement." Like now, Joe's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. A marriage of convenience. A legal protection. It made sense, really. It would solve all their problems. So why did the words, "on paper only," feel like a knife to the chest? "Let me think about it," she managed to say. Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. "Take your time." And no pressure, but as Joe returned to her room and watched the sun rise over the snow-covered land, she knew there was pressure. Not from Marcus, but from her own treacherous heart, which had somehow decided to fall in love with a scarred, silent man who carved wooden animals and looked at her like she was something precious. The storm broke that afternoon, and with it came a visitor. Joe was in the kitchen making bread when she heard horses. She looked out to see 3 riders approaching, 2 men and a woman. The lead rider was a man in his 50s, well-dressed, with the air of someone used to authority. Behind him rode a younger man who looked like a hired gun, and a woman in her 40s with a pinched, disapproving expression. Marcus came in from the barn, his face darkening when he saw the visitors. He wrote quickly on his slate and showed it to Joe, "Lawrence Pritchard." "Trouble." Joe wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch beside Marcus. The riders stopped in front of the house, and Pritchard dismounted with practiced ease. "Marcus Dawson," he said, his voice carrying false warmth. "Haven't seen you in months. How are you managing out here?" Marcus said nothing, just watched with wary eyes. Pritchard's gaze shifted to Joe, and she felt his assessment like a physical touch. "And who might this be? I heard you had a woman living here now. Miss Mercer, isn't it? The one Theodore Ashford so wisely refused." Joe felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her chin high. "That's right. I'm the housekeeper here, housekeeper." Pritchard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Is that what they're calling it these days? Living alone with a man, unchaperoned? My wife here, Mrs. Pritchard, is quite concerned about the moral implications." Mrs. Pritchard sniffed. "It's disgraceful. Setting a poor example for the boy. Tommy is well cared for," Joe said sharply. "Better than he's ever been." "That's actually why we're here," Pritchard continued. "You see, there's been some concern in town about whether Marcus is fit to raise a child. A man who can't speak, who lives in isolation, who now has an unmarried woman of questionable character living in his home." Marcus moved so fast that Joe didn't have time to react. He grabbed Pritchard by the collar and slammed him against the porch rail, his face twisted with fury. The hired man reached for his gun, but Joe stepped between them. "Stop. Everyone just stop." Marcus released Pritchard and stepped back, breathing hard. He grabbed his slate and wrote in large, angry letters, "Get off my land." Pritchard straightened his collar. His false friendliness replaced with cold anger. "You're proving my point, Dawson. A man who can't control his temper shouldn't be raising a child. I'm filing a petition with Judge Morrison. There'll be a hearing to determine Tommy's custody. You'd better hope you can convince the judge that this arrangement," he gestured between Marcus and Joe, "is appropriate for a young boy." "When?" Joe demanded. 2 weeks. At the courthouse." Pritchard mounted his horse. "I suggest you get your affairs in order. And Miss Mercer, you might want to start looking for new employment. Once the town knows you've been living here in sin, no respectable family will hire you." They rode away, leaving Marcus and Joe standing on the porch in stunned silence. Joe's mind was racing. A custody hearing. The town's judgment. Tommy being taken away. Marcus's hands were shaking as he wrote, "My fault. Should never have brought you here. Ruined everything." "No," Joe said firmly. "No, you haven't ruined anything. Pritchard is looking for an excuse to take Tommy. He probably wants your land, it has the best water rights in the valley, doesn't it? Marcus nodded slowly. Then we fight. And we start by taking away his ammunition. Jo took a deep breath, her heart pounding. We get married. For real, with witnesses and a legal ceremony. Before the hearing. Then we show up united, as a family, and we dare them to say we're not fit. Are you sure? Marcus wrote. It's a big step. Would be binding, I'm sure. Tommy needs us. And we need each other, even if we haven't said it out loud. Jo met his eyes. Unless you don't want, Marcus dropped his slate and cupped her face in his scarred hands. He leaned down slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and kissed her. It was gentle and careful and full of everything he couldn't say with words. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet. He picked up his slate and wrote, I wanted to ask properly. Wanted to court you. Wanted you to know it wasn't just convenience. I know, Jo whispered. I've known for a while now. I just wasn't sure you felt the same, felt it since the first day. Since you knelt in the mud and refused to break. They stood there on the porch, holding each other while the sun set and painted the snow-covered world in shades of gold and pink. Inside, they could hear Tommy practicing his piano scales, the out-of-tune notes somehow perfect in their imperfection. They had 2 weeks to prepare. 2 weeks to build a case that they were a real family. 2 weeks to convince a town that had already judged them that love came in unexpected forms. It would have to be enough. They were married 3 days later in the small church on the edge of Bitter Creek, with Tommy as their only witness and Pastor Henderson officiating. The ceremony was simple and quick, performed in the late afternoon when most of the town was occupied elsewhere. Jo wore her best dress, the blue one she'd brought from Ohio, carefully mended and pressed. Marcus wore a suit that had belonged to his brother, altered to fit his broader frame. Tommy stood between them, scrubbed clean and wearing the shirt Jo had finally finished, his hair combed down for once. Pastor Henderson was an elderly man with kind eyes and a pragmatic view of frontier life. He'd known Marcus and Robert since they'd first come to Wyoming territory, and he'd baptized Tommy when the boy was just 3 days old. When Marcus had come to him with his slate, explaining the situation, Henderson hadn't hesitated. I've been wondering when you two would figure it out, he'd said. Making Jo blush. Anyone with eyes could see how you look at each other. Now, as Henderson spoke the ancient words of the marriage ceremony, Jo felt the weight of what they were doing settle over her like a blanket. This was real. Legal. Binding. Marcus placed a simple gold band on her finger. It had been Catherine's, and Tommy had insisted she would have wanted Jo to have it. When it came time for Jo to place a ring on Marcus's finger, she slipped on a band they'd fashioned from braided copper wire, all they'd had time to make. I now pronounce you man and wife, Henderson said. Marcus, you may kiss your bride. Marcus looked at Jo, a question in his eyes. She nodded, and he leaned down to kiss her, quick and chaste. Appropriate for a church, but his hand trembled as it cupped her cheek. They signed the registry with Henderson and Tommy as witnesses. The pastor pressed the official certificate into Jo's hands and squeezed her shoulder. You've taken on a heavy burden, Mrs. Dawson. Not just Marcus and Tommy, but the judgment of this town. They won't make it easy for you. Nothing worth having ever is, Jo replied. They drove home in the wagon as dusk fell, Tommy chattering excitedly about being part of a wedding. Marcus was quiet, his hand resting on Jo's knee as he drove. When they arrived home, he helped her down from the wagon, but instead of releasing her, he pulled her close and wrote on his slate with his free hand, "Thank you. For saying yes. For fighting for us, we're in this together now," Jo said. All three of us. That's what family means. That night, after Tommy had gone to bed still talking about the wedding, Marcus and Jo sat in the parlor. The fire crackled in the hearth, and outside, an owl hooted in the darkness. Marcus kept glancing at Jo, then away, his expression troubled. Finally, he wrote, "I know this was for appearances. For the hearing. You don't have to. I mean, your room is still yours. I won't expect, Marcus. Joe took the slate from his hands and set it aside. I didn't marry you just for appearances. I married you because I wanted to. Because somewhere along the way, you and Tommy became my family. My home. And if you think I'm going to spend my wedding night alone in that narrow bed, you're not as smart as I thought you were. Marcus's eyes widened. He reached for his slate, but Joe caught his hands. You don't need words for this, she whispered. He pulled her close, and this time when he kissed her, there was nothing chaste about it. It was deep and hungry and full of months of longing kept carefully hidden. Joe's hands found his hair, and his arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her slightly off the floor. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Marcus rested his forehead against hers. She felt him shaking, not with passion but with emotion. When she looked up, she saw tears on his scarred cheeks. What's wrong? She asked softly. He picked up his slate with trembling hands. Never thought I'd have this again. Thought I was too broken. Too damaged. We're all broken in some way, Joe said. But maybe broken things fit together better. Maybe they understand each other. Sarah, my first wife, she was beautiful. Perfect. I loved her, but I always felt like I wasn't enough. Like she deserved better, and now I feel like I finally found someone who sees me. Not the scars. Not the silence. Just me. Joe kissed him again, tasting salt from his tears. Then take me upstairs, husband. And let me show you exactly what I see. They climbed the stairs hand in hand. And for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Joe didn't go to her narrow room at the end of the hall. She went to Marcus's room, where he lit a lamp with shaking hands and turned to face her with a mixture of desire and vulnerability that made her heart ache. She helped him out of his jacket, then his shirt, revealing more of the scars she'd only glimpsed before. They covered his left shoulder and chest, puckered and shiny in the lamplight. She traced them gently with her fingers, and he flinched. They're ugly, he wrote on the slate he'd brought upstairs. They're proof you survived, Joe corrected. Proof you're strong enough to endure anything. How could I find that ugly? She let him unlace her dress, his fingers fumbling with the hooks and buttons. When he struggled, frustrated, she helped him, and soon they were standing in their underclothes, studying each other in the soft light. Joe had spent her whole life being ashamed of her body, of the curves and softness that the world told her were wrong. But the way Marcus looked at her, with reverence and hunger and something that looked like awe, made her feel beautiful for the first time in her life. He traced the line of her collarbone, then lower, and she shivered. His hands were rough from work but gentle, always so gentle. When he picked her up and laid her on the bed, she saw a question in his eyes. Yes, she said. Yes to all of it. The next morning, Joe woke wrapped in Marcus's arms, sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment, she just lay there, feeling the rise and fall of his chest, the warmth of his skin against hers. She'd spent so many years believing no one would ever want her this way, that she was too much or not enough or simply wrong. But Marcus had loved her like she was precious, like every curve and softness was something to be treasured. She felt him wake, felt his arms tighten around her. He pressed a kiss to her shoulder, then her neck, then her jaw. When she turned to face him, he was smiling, really smiling, not the careful half-smile she'd seen before. It transformed his face, making him look younger, lighter. Good morning, husband, she whispered. He kissed her in response, long and slow, and they might have stayed in bed all day if Tommy hadn't knocked on the door. Uncle Marcus. Miss Joe. Are you awake? I'm hungry. Joe laughed and called out, we'll be down in 10 minutes, Tommy. Start the fire in the kitchen stove for me, okay? Can we have pancakes, if you want them? They heard his footsteps thunder down the stairs. Marcus traced Joe's face with his fingers, his expression soft. Then he reluctantly pulled away and began dressing. Joe did the same, acutely aware of how intimate it was to dress in front of someone, to have them help with buttons and laces. As she pinned up her hair, she caught Marcus watching her in the small mirror on his dresser. She met his eyes in the reflection. "What is it?" He came to stand behind her and wrote on his slate, "Beautiful." "You're beautiful," Joe's throat tightened. "Marcus," he turned her to face him and wrote, "I mean it. Always thought so. From the first day, even covered in mud." Especially then. He grinned. Fierce. Unbroken. Magnificent. They went downstairs to find Tommy had indeed started the fire, though he'd made a bit of a mess in the process. Joe set about making pancakes while Marcus made coffee, and they fell into their morning routine with Tommy chattering between them. But everything felt different now. When Marcus passed behind Joe to reach for something, his hand would brush her waist. When Joe handed Tommy his plate, she'd catch Marcus watching her with heat in his eyes. When Tommy went out to feed the chickens, Marcus pulled Joe into his arms and kissed her breathless against the counter. "We have to stop," she gasped when he finally released her. "Tommy could come back any moment," Marcus wrote, "don't care. Want everyone to know you're mine, they will soon enough. We have to go to town tomorrow. File the marriage certificate. Make it official in the public record." Marcus's expression sobered. "Pritchard will know, good. Let him know. Let him know he can't take Tommy from us because we're a legitimate family now." The trip to town the next day felt like walking into a lion's den. Joe sat beside Marcus on the wagon seat, wearing her wedding ring and her best dress, her spine straight and her chin high. Tommy sat between them, holding the wooden horse Marcus had carved for him on their first day. They went first to the county clerk's office to register the marriage. The clerk, a thin man with spectacles, looked at them with undisguised curiosity. "You're Marcus Dawson. The one who can't talk," Marcus nodded, "and you married this woman." "When?" 3 days ago, Joe said firmly. Pastor Henderson officiated. "Here's the certificate." The clerk examined it, then looked at Joe. "You're the mail-order bride Theodore Ashford refused." "I'm Mrs. Marcus Dawson," Joe corrected. "And we're here to make our marriage a matter of public record." The clerk shrugged and made the necessary notations in his ledger. "That'll be $2 for the filing fee," Marcus paid, and they received their official copy. As they left the office, Joe saw several townspeople watching them with interest. Word would spread fast. By nightfall, everyone in Bitter Creek would know that Marcus Dawson had married the woman Theodore had rejected. They stopped at the general store for supplies. The pinch-faced clerk who'd been so dismissive of Joe that first day was behind the counter. Her eyes widened when she saw them together. "Mrs. Dawson," Joe said pleasantly. "I need flour, sugar, coffee, and salt. Also thread in blue and green, if you have it, Mrs. You're married then?" "I am. To Mr. Dawson here." 3 days ago, the clerk's eyes darted between them, clearly trying to reconcile the scarred, silent rancher with the woman she dismissed as a charity case. "I see. Well. Congratulations. I suppose." As the clerk gathered their supplies, Joe saw Theodore Ashford enter the store. He froze when he saw her, his face going pale, then red. "Josephine, it's Mrs. Dawson now," Joe said calmly. "You married him? That mute rancher?" Theodore's voice was loud enough to turn heads. "I know why. You couldn't get anyone else, could you? Had to settle for damaged goods." Marcus moved so fast that Joe barely saw it. One moment he was standing beside her, the next he had Theodore pressed against the wall, his forearm across the man's throat. Theodore's eyes went wide with fear as Marcus leaned in close, his dark eyes blazing. "Marcus, don't," Joe said quietly. "He's not worth it." For a long moment, Marcus didn't move. Then he released Theodore and stepped back. He pulled out his slate and wrote in large letters, "He didn't settle. I did. And I got the better end of the deal." He showed it to Theodore, then to the entire store, making sure everyone could read it. Then he took Joe's hand and led her out, leaving Theodore gasping and the other customers whispering. Outside, Tommy was waiting by the wagon. "Did you punch him, Uncle Marcus?" "Did you?" Marcus shook his head and ruffled the boy's hair. "Darn," Tommy said. "I would have." Joe laughed despite herself. "Violence isn't the answer, Tommy, but sometimes it feels like it should be," the boy muttered. They were loading supplies into the wagon when Lawrence Pritchard appeared, his wife beside him. "Well, well. The happy couple. How convenient that you married just days before the custody hearing." "Convenient or not, it's legal," Joe said. "We're a married couple raising Tommy in a proper home." "Proper?" Mrs. Pritchard sniffed. "You were living in sin for weeks before you married. The whole town knows it. The whole town can think what it likes," Joe said. "We know the truth. And so does God. Judge Morrison will decide the truth," Pritchard said. "And I think he'll agree that a woman who was rejected by one man and immediately took up with another, living unmarried under his roof, is hardly fit to raise a child." Marcus pulled out his slate and wrote, "Tommy is my nephew. My blood. You have no claim to him. I have a claim to protecting the children of this community from improper influences," Pritchard replied. "You'll see that at the hearing. 1 week from today, Dawson. Better prepare your defense." He and his wife walked away, leaving Joe and Marcus standing in the street. Joe felt cold despite the autumn sun. 1 week. They had 1 week to build a case that they were fit parents, that their love was real, that Tommy belonged with them. "We need allies," Joe said quietly. "People who will speak for us. Pastor Henderson will, but we need more. We need people who've seen how we've changed. How Tommy has thrived." Marcus nodded and wrote, "Miss Hartley. She runs the boarding house. Knew you before. Might speak to the change, and the doctor, if Tommy's been seen by him. Can we show Tommy's improvement? That he's cleaner, better fed, learning, we can try." They spent the next week preparing. Joe took Tommy to see Dr. Hayes, the town physician, who examined the boy and noted with approval how much healthier he looked than the last time he'd seen him. "Putting on weight, growing taller, no signs of neglect," the doctor said. "Whatever you're doing, Mrs. Dawson, keep doing it." Joe convinced Mrs. Hartley to visit the ranch, to see for herself how the house had been transformed. The older woman walked through the clean rooms, saw the repaired furniture and fresh curtains, Tommy's neat bedroom with his schoolwork displayed on the wall. In the kitchen, she tasted Joe's preserves and bread, examined the well-stocked pantry. "You've worked miracles here," Mrs. Hartley said grudgingly. "I won't lie to the judge about that." They gathered letters of reference. Pastor Henderson wrote a glowing account of their character and commitment. Dr. Hayes provided a medical assessment of Tommy's improved health. Even some of the neighboring ranchers, men who'd known Marcus and Robert, wrote letters testifying to Marcus's character and capability, but Joe knew it might not be enough. Pritchard had money and influence. He had the ear of powerful people. And he had the trump card of social propriety, the fact that Joe had lived at the ranch unmarried, that their marriage seemed suspiciously timed. The night before the hearing, Joe couldn't sleep. She lay in bed beside Marcus, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with all the things that could go wrong. "What if we lose?" she whispered into the darkness. Marcus turned toward her and pulled her close. In the moonlight streaming through the window, she could see him reach for the slate he now kept on the nightstand. He wrote, "We won't, but if we do, then we fight harder. We appeal. We do whatever it takes. Tommy Isours. Our son. And no one is taking him." Joe pressed her face against his chest, drawing strength from his certainty. I'm scared, Marcus. I've lost everything before. I can't lose this. I can't lose you and Tommy, you won't. I promise. He tilted her chin up and kissed her. We're a family. Nothing can break that. They made love then, slow and tender, finding comfort in each other. Afterward, Joe finally slept, wrapped in Marcus's arms, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. The courthouse was packed when they arrived the next morning. It seemed like half of Bitter Creek had turned out to watch the spectacle. Joe saw Theodore in the back, smirking. She saw Mrs. Howell and Grace from the boarding house. Mrs. Cooper and Miss Evans, the women who'd quit working for Marcus. She saw curious faces and judgmental eyes and a few sympathetic glances. Lawrence Pritchard sat at one table with his lawyer, a slick man from Cheyenne. Marcus, Joe, and Tommy sat at another with Pastor Henderson beside them. They couldn't afford a lawyer, but Henderson had offered to speak on their behalf. Judge Morrison was a stern man in his 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes. He called the hearing to order and asked Pritchard to present his case. Pritchard's lawyer stood and painted a damning picture. He called witnesses who testified that Joe had lived at the ranch unmarried for weeks. Mrs. Cooper described the deplorable condition of the house when she'd worked there, implying it was still that way. Miss Evans said she'd quit because she felt unsafe around Marcus, who she claimed had violent tendencies. The man can't even speak, the lawyer argued. How can he properly parent a child? How can he teach him, discipline him, prepare him for life? And this woman, he gestured at Joe, she was rejected by one man and immediately moved in with another. She's clearly desperate for security and willing to compromise her morals to get it. Is that the kind of influence we want on a young, impressionable boy? Joe felt her face burn with shame and anger. She wanted to stand up and scream that they were lying, that they didn't know anything about Marcus or Tommy or what they'd built together. But Pastor Henderson put a hand on her arm, steadying her. When it was their turn, Henderson stood. He was old, but his voice rang out clear and strong. Your Honor, I've known Marcus Dawson for 10 years. I knew his brother Robert. I baptized Tommy when he was 3 days old. And I married Marcus and Josephine 3 weeks ago. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Henderson continued, Mr. Pritchard would have you believe that Marcus is unfit because he cannot speak. But silence doesn't mean inability. Marcus runs a successful ranch. He saved his nephew from a fire that killed his parents, nearly dying himself in the process. He has provided for Tommy for 3 years, doing the best he could with the resources he had. And Mrs. Dawson, the judge asked. Mrs. Dawson arrived in Bitter Creek with nothing. She had been rejected and humiliated. She could have given up, could have returned to wherever she came from in defeat. Instead, she accepted honest work. She transformed that household. I've seen the change myself. The house is clean, the boy is healthy, they function as a family, but they live together unmarried, Pritchard's lawyer interjected. That shows a lack of moral character, that shows poverty and pragmatism, Henderson shot back. This is the frontier, not Boston. A woman needed work and shelter. A man needed help with his home and nephew. They found a solution that benefited both. And when it became clear that their feelings had deepened, they married properly and legally. There is no shame in that, the judge looked skeptical. Mr. Pritchard, why are you really bringing this case? What is your interest in the boy? Pritchard stood, his expression earnest. I'm concerned about the welfare of children in our community, Your Honor. Tommy deserves a stable home with proper role models. My wife and I have no children of our own. We could provide him with education, opportunity, a respected place in society, and Marcus Dawson's ranch. Henderson interrupted. The one with the best water rights in the valley. The one you've been trying to buy for years. Would that perhaps also come under your control if Tommy were in your custody? The courtroom erupted in whispers. Pritchard's face went red. That has nothing to do with, doesn't it? Henderson pressed. You've made no secret of wanting that land. And with Tommy in your custody, you'd control his inheritance until he came of age. Very convenient. That's a serious accusation, Pastor, the judge said, and I stand by it, Your Honor. This case isn't about Tommy's welfare. It's about land and money. Lawrence Pritchard is using the law to steal a child from his rightful guardian. The judge banged his gavel. Order. I'll hear from the boy himself. Tommy Dawson, come forward. Tommy looked at Marcus with frightened eyes. Marcus squeezed his shoulder and nodded. Slowly, the boy walked to the front of the courtroom. He looked so small standing before the judge's high bench. Tommy, Judge Morrison said more gently, I need you to answer some questions truthfully. Can you do that? Yes, sir. Are you happy living with your Uncle Marcus and Mrs. Dawson? Yes, sir. Very happy. Tell me about your life there. What's a normal day like? Tommy took a deep breath. I wake up and Mrs. Dawson, makes breakfast. Real breakfast, with eggs and bacon and biscuits. Not just cold beans. Then Uncle Marcus and I do chores. I feed the chickens and collect eggs. Then Mrs. Dawson teaches me reading and writing and arithmetic. She's teaching me from Mama's old books. In the afternoon, I practice piano. The piano Mama used to play. And Uncle Marcus carves things for me, animals and toys. And at dinner, we all eat together like a family, and before Mrs. Dawson came. What was it like then? Tommy's face fell. It was sad. Uncle Marcus tried, but he was sad all the time. And I was sad too because I missed Mama and Papa. The house was messy and we didn't eat good food and I didn't have anyone to talk to because Uncle Marcus can't talk and I can't read his writing yet. But now it's better. Now we're happy again. Do you want to live with Mr. and Mrs. Pritchard? No. Tommy's voice rang out clearly. I want to stay with Uncle Marcus and Mrs. Dawson. They're my family. Mr. Pritchard is mean and his wife looks at me like I'm dirty and they don't love me. They just want our land. Everyone knows it, that's enough, the judge said, but not unkindly. You can return to your seat, son. Tommy ran back to Marcus, who pulled him into a tight hug. Joe saw tears on the boy's face and felt her own eyes burning. The judge looked at Pritchard. Mr. Pritchard, I've heard enough. Your concerns about the boy's welfare seem less important than your concerns about property. While the timing of the Dawsons' marriage may raise eyebrows, I see no evidence that Tommy is being neglected or harmed. In fact, all evidence points to the opposite. He's thriving, but Your Honor, Pritchard started. My decision is made. Tommy Dawson will remain in the custody of his Uncle Marcus and his wife Josephine. This case is dismissed. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom. For a moment, no one moved. Then Tommy let out a whoop of joy and threw his arms around Marcus's neck. Marcus held him tight, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Joe felt hands on hers and looked up to see Pastor Henderson smiling at her. Congratulations, Mrs. Dawson. Your family is safe. Around them, the courtroom erupted. Some people cheered, others muttered in disappointment. Pritchard's face was purple with rage as he stormed out, his lawyer and wife hurrying after him. Theodore Ashford slipped out quietly, no longer smirking, but Joe barely noticed any of it. She was focused on Marcus and Tommy, on the way they clung to each other, on the relief and joy radiating from them both. When Marcus finally released Tommy and turned to her, his eyes were red but shining. He pulled her into his arms, holding both her and Tommy, making them a circle of three. Outside the courthouse, several townspeople approached to offer congratulations. Mrs. Hartley shook Joe's hand. You've got backbone, girl. I respect that. Dr. Hayes clapped Marcus on the shoulder. Even a few people who'd been skeptical admitted they were glad the family would stay together, as they drove home in the wagon. Tommy between them once again, Jo felt a peace settle over her that she'd never known before. This was what home felt like. Not a place, but people. Not perfection, but acceptance. Not what she'd imagined when she'd stepped off that stagecoach months ago, but something infinitely better. Marcus reached over Tommy's head and took her hand. He squeezed it 3 times, their private code for, "I love you," and she squeezed back 4 times, "I love you too." They were finally, truly, safe. Winter came in earnest 2 weeks after the hearing, blanketing the ranch in snow that lasted until March. During those long, cold months, the Dawson family settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Jo had never known such contentment existed, waking each morning in Marcus's arms, spending her days caring for their home and teaching Tommy, falling asleep each night with a sense of purpose and belonging that had eluded her all her life. Tommy thrived in ways that amazed them both. The frightened, half-wild child who'd hidden in the barn had transformed into a bright, curious boy who peppered Jo with questions and followed Marcus around the ranch learning everything about cattle and horses and land management. He was reading now, really reading, devouring every book they had and begging for more. Jo had to make a special trip to town just to buy new primers and storybooks. The town's attitude toward them had shifted too. After the hearing, after Judge Morrison's public dismissal of Pritchard's claims, people began treating the Dawsons with a grudging respect. Mrs. Hartley recommended Jo to other families who needed sewing work, and Jo found herself taking in mending and alterations for extra money. Marcus's reputation as a fair dealer and hard worker had never been in question, and now with a stable family, other ranchers began including him in their gatherings and consultations. Lawrence Pritchard had left town shortly after the hearing, humiliated and defeated. Rumor had it he'd sold his ranch and moved to Colorado. His wife had gone back east to live with relatives. Theodore Ashford kept his distance. Though Jo occasionally saw him in town, always looking away when their eyes met. She felt nothing for him now, no anger, no satisfaction, just indifference. He'd done her a favor, really, by rejecting her. If he'd married her as planned, she never would have found this life, this family, this love. On Christmas morning, Jo woke to find the house transformed. Marcus and Tommy had been up before dawn decorating. Evergreen branches festooned the doorways, candles flickered on every surface, and a small pine tree stood in the corner of the parlor, decorated with popcorn strings and paper ornaments Tommy had made. "Merry Christmas, Mrs. Dawson," Tommy said, practically vibrating with excitement. "We made breakfast." "Well, Uncle Marcus made it." "I helped." Jo wrapped her robe around herself and followed him downstairs to find the kitchen table laden with food, pancakes, bacon, eggs, even biscuits that were only slightly burnt on the bottom. Marcus stood by the stove, grinning at her surprised expression. "You two are full of secrets," she said, pulling Tommy into a hug. After breakfast, they exchanged gifts by the tree. Jo had sewn Tommy new clothes, shirts and pants that actually fit, a warm coat for winter. For Marcus, she'd made a new shirt from the finest fabric she could afford, with careful stitching around the collar and cuffs. Marcus gave her a beautiful shawl he'd bought in Cheyenne, soft wool in deep blue that brought out her eyes. For Tommy, he'd carved an entire ranch scene, a house, barn, fences, and a dozen animals, each one perfect in miniature. Tommy gasped when he saw it. "Uncle Marcus, this must have taken forever," Marcus wrote on his slate, started the day Jo arrived. "Wanted it to be special." Jo felt tears prick her eyes. All those evenings when Marcus had sat by the fire carving, she'd thought he was just keeping his hands busy. But he'd been creating this, planning ahead for this moment, believing even then that they'd still be together at Christmas. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Everything is beautiful." That afternoon, Pastor Henderson and his wife came for Christmas dinner, along with Mrs. Hartley and the Hayes family. It was the first time Jo had hosted a proper dinner party, and she'd been terrified she'd mess it up. But the roasted chicken was perfect, the vegetables were tender, and her apple pie, made from Catherine's recipe, earned praise from everyone. As they sat around the crowded table, laughing and talking, Joe looked at the faces gathered there. These were their people now. Their community. The ones who'd stood by them, who'd testified at the hearing, who'd welcomed them despite the town's initial skepticism. Tommy was in his element, chattering to Dr. Hayes about the books he'd been reading. Marcus sat at the head of the table, his hand occasionally finding Joe's under the tablecloth. Squeezing in that pattern that meant, "I love you, I propose a toast," Pastor Henderson said, raising his glass. To the Dawsons, Marcus, Joe, and Tommy. May this be the first of many happy Christmases together. Everyone raised their glasses, and Joe felt her throat tighten with emotion. She'd come so far from that day in the rain when Theodore had walked away. She'd been so certain then that her life was over, that she'd never find a place where she belonged. But here she was, surrounded by love and warmth and acceptance. Here she was, home. Winter melted into spring, and with the thaw came new life. The garden Joe had planted the previous fall began to sprout, green shoots pushing through the dark earth, promising vegetables and herbs in the months to come. The cattle that had survived the harsh winter grew fat on new grass. Hope, the heifer they'd saved, gave birth to a healthy calf that Tommy immediately named Lucky, but the biggest change was in Joe herself. She'd started feeling unwell in early March, nothing serious, just nausea in the mornings and unusual fatigue. At first, she'd blamed it on the tail end of winter, on the hard work of ranch life. But when her monthly courses didn't come, and then didn't come again, she began to suspect. She waited another week before going to see Dr. Hayes, riding into town alone while Marcus and Tommy worked on repairing the barn roof. The doctor examined her and confirmed what she'd already guessed. "You're with child, Mrs. Dawson. About 3 months along, I'd say. Baby should come in September." Joe sat in stunned silence. A baby. She was going to have a baby. She and Marcus were going to have a baby. Is everything all right? Dr. Hayes asked, concerned by her silence. "Yes," Joe managed. "Yes, everything is perfect. I need to tell my husband." She rode home in a daze, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. A baby. A child of her own. She'd thought that dream had died when Theodore rejected her. She'd thought she'd never have the chance to be a mother. But here she was, carrying new life, about to give Marcus and Tommy a gift she hadn't even known she could offer. Marcus was in the barn when she returned, mucking out stalls. He looked up when she entered, immediately noticing something was different. He set down his pitchfork and came to her, concern written on his face. Joe took his hands and placed them on her stomach. "I went to see Dr. Hayes today." Marcus's eyes widened with alarm. He grabbed his slate. "Are you sick?" "No, not sick. I'm pregnant, Marcus. We're going to have a baby." For a moment, Marcus just stared at her. Then his legs seemed to give out, and he sat down hard on a hay bale. His hands were shaking as he wrote, "A baby?" "Are you sure?" Dr. Hayes confirmed it. "September, he thinks." Marcus dropped the slate and pulled Joe into his arms, burying his face in her shoulder. She felt him shaking and realized he was crying, great, silent sobs that racked his whole body. She held him, running her fingers through his hair, letting him release whatever emotions were overwhelming him. When he finally pulled back, his face was wet but his eyes were shining. He picked up his slate and wrote, "Never thought I'd have this again. After Sarah and the baby died. Thought that chance was gone forever." "I know," Joe said softly. "I never thought I'd have it at all. But we do. We get this chance, together." "Scared," Marcus wrote. "What if something goes wrong? Then we'll face it together, just like we've faced everything else." "But Marcus, we can't live in fear. We have to have faith that this baby will be healthy and strong. Just like us." He nodded and pulled her close again, his hands spread protectively over her stomach. They stayed like that for a long time, just holding each other in the quiet barn, listening to the horses shift in their stalls and the barn cat purr from her perch on a hay bale. That evening, they told Tommy at dinner. The boy's reaction was everything they could have hoped for. A baby? Really? I'm going to be a big brother. His face lit up like the sun. Can it be a girl? I want a sister. Boys are boring, Joe laughed. We don't get to choose, sweetheart. But either way, you'll be the big brother. That's an important job, I know. I'll teach them everything. How to feed the chickens and find eggs and ride Daisy Ann. He paused, suddenly worried. Will you still have time for me? When the baby comes, Joe's heart clenched. Oh, Tommy. Always. You'll always be our boy. The baby doesn't change that. It just means our family gets bigger. Marcus reached over and ruffled Tommy's hair, then wrote on his slate, "You're my nephew and my son. Nothing changes that." Ever. Tommy nodded, satisfied, and returned to his dinner with renewed enthusiasm, already planning all the things he'd teach his new sibling. The months that followed were some of the happiest of Joe's life. As her belly grew, Marcus became even more protective, insisting she rest more, refusing to let her do heavy work. Tommy appointed himself her helper, fetching things she needed and patting her stomach to talk to the baby. They spent long evenings discussing names, painting the spare room that would become the nursery, preparing for the new arrival. In July, as Joe was hanging laundry in the yard, she heard horses approaching. She looked up to see a group of riders, 5 men, all armed, all with hard faces. Her heart began to pound. Marcus was in the far pasture checking on the herd. Tommy was in the barn. She was alone, the lead rider dismounted, and Joe recognized him despite the years that had passed. He was one of Pritchard's former ranch hands. A mean-looking man with cold eyes, Mrs. Dawson, he said, tipping his hat with false courtesy. Remember me? Jake Sullivan. Used to work for Mr. Pritchard. Mr. Pritchard doesn't live here anymore, Joe said, keeping her voice steady. Whatever business you have, you should take it up with him in Colorado. Oh, this business is here. See, Mr. Pritchard paid us good money before he left. Paid us to make sure Marcus Dawson regretted what he did. Taking that land Mr. Pritchard wanted so bad. Getting the law on his side. Making Mr. Pritchard look like a fool. Joe's blood ran cold. If you touch my husband, your husband ain't here, is he? But you are. And that barn. And that nice house. Sullivan smiled, showing yellow teeth. Shame if something were to happen to them. You touch anything on this property and I'll see you hanged, Joe said, trying to sound braver than she felt. Sullivan laughed. Who's going to stop us? Your mute husband. That kid? You. His eyes dropped to her swollen belly. You're in no condition to fight, Mrs. Dawson. One of the other men dismounted and pulled out a torch. Joe's heart hammered in her chest. The barn. Tommy was in the barn. She started to move toward it, but Sullivan grabbed her arm. Where do you think you're going? Let me go. Joe struggled, but his grip was iron. Light it, Sullivan ordered his man. Start with the barn. No. Joe screamed. Tommy's in there. There's a child in there. For a moment, Sullivan hesitated. Then his expression hardened. Should have thought about that before your husband crossed Mr. Pritchard. The man with the torch approached the barn. Joe fought desperately, kicking and clawing, but Sullivan held her fast. She watched in horror as the torch touched the dry wood of the barn wall. Then everything happened at once. A gunshot rang out, and the man with the torch dropped it, clutching his hand. Marcus burst from the trees on his horse, rifle in hand, Tommy clinging to his back. He must have seen the riders from the pasture and circled back through the woods to get Tommy to safety first. Marcus fired again, this time at Sullivan's feet. The man released Joe and Dove for cover. The other men reached for their weapons, but Marcus was faster. He fired 3 more shots in quick succession, not aiming to kill but to frighten, bullets kicking up dirt around the men's feet, splintering wood near their heads. Sullivan and his men scrambled for their horses, abandoning the dropped torch. As they fled, Marcus lowered his rifle and jumped from his horse, running to Joe. He pulled her into his arms, checking her frantically for injuries, his hands shaking. "I'm fine," Joe gasped. "The baby's fine." But the barn, Tommy had already grabbed a bucket and was throwing water on the small fire the torch had started. Marcus released Joe and ran to help, and together they doused the flames before they could spread. The damage was minor, a small section of wall scorched but not destroyed. When the fire was out, Marcus pulled both Joe and Tommy into his arms, holding them so tightly Joe could barely breathe. She felt him shaking, felt the terror radiating from him. He'd almost lost them. They'd all almost died. "We need to tell the sheriff," Joe said when she could finally speak. "Those men will come back. They won't stop until..." Marcus was already nodding. He wrote on his slate, "I'm going to town. Now. You and Tommy stay in the house. Lock the doors. Load the shotgun. Marcus, you can't go alone. What if they're waiting? I have to. Need the law. Need witnesses." He cupped her face in his hands. "I'll be careful. I promise." He saddled a fresh horse and rode hard for Bitter Creek, leaving Joe and Tommy barricaded in the house with the shotgun across Joe's lap and her heart in her throat. Every sound made her jump. Every shadow seemed threatening. Tommy sat pressed against her side, trying to be brave but clearly terrified. "It's going to be all right," Joe kept saying, though she wasn't sure who she was trying to convince, Tommy or herself. Marcus returned 3 hours later with Sheriff Blake, Deputy Morris, and Pastor Henderson. They'd caught Sullivan and his men at the saloon, bragging about what they'd done. The sheriff arrested them on the spot for arson and assault. Sullivan had tried to claim they were just teaching Dawson a lesson, but with multiple witnesses to their bragging and the physical evidence at the ranch, there was no question of their guilt. "They'll hang for this," Sheriff Blake told Marcus and Joe. "Attempted murder of a woman and child. Arson. The judge won't take kindly to it," and he didn't. The trial was swift and decisive. All 5 men were sentenced to prison, with Sullivan getting 20 years. Theodore Ashford, who'd apparently been funding Pritchard's revenge from the shadows, was fined heavily and forced to sell his bank under threat of criminal charges. He left Bitter Creek in disgrace, and Joe never heard from him again, but the attack had shaken them all. For weeks afterward, Marcus barely slept, constantly checking the windows and doors, refusing to let Joe or Tommy out of his sight. Tommy had nightmares again, waking screaming about fire. And Joe, despite Dr. Hayes's assurances that the baby was fine, worried constantly about the stress on her pregnancy. It was Pastor Henderson who finally helped them heal. He came to the ranch one Sunday afternoon and found them all huddled in the parlor, Marcus pacing while Joe tried to comfort a weeping Tommy. "Enough," Henderson said firmly. "What happened was terrible. But you survived. You protected each other. And those men will never hurt you again. You can't live in fear of shadows. You have too much life ahead of you." He was right. Slowly, painfully, they began to relax again. Marcus still checked the doors at night, but he slept better. Tommy's nightmares faded. And Joe felt the baby kick and roll inside her, proof of life continuing despite fear and danger. On September 15th, as the first autumn leaves began to fall, Joe went into labor. Marcus sent Tommy to fetch Dr. Hayes while he stayed with Joe, holding her hand and wiping her forehead with a cool cloth. The labor was long and difficult. Joe had always known that bearing children would be harder for a woman her size, but Marcus never left her side. When the baby finally came, crying lustily as Dr. Hayes held her up, Joe's first thought was that she'd never heard a more beautiful sound. A girl. They had a daughter. Marcus cut the cord with shaking hands, then took the baby while Dr. Hayes tended to Joe. When Joe finally held her daughter, cleaned and wrapped in a soft blanket, she looked into the tiny face and felt her heart expand in ways she hadn't known were possible. "She's perfect," Joe whispered. Marcus wrote on his slate, "What should we name her?" Joe looked at Tommy, who was peeking around the doorway with wide eyes. "Come meet your sister, Tommy." The boy crept closer, staring at the baby with awe. "She's so small." "You were this small once," Joe said. "Tommy, your Uncle Marcus and I talked about names. We'd like to honor your mother. Would it be all right with you if we named her Catherine? We could call her Catherine or Kate or Katie, whatever feels right." Tommy's eyes filled with tears. "You'd name her after Mama? Your mother would have loved this baby," Joe said. "She would have been a wonderful grandmother." "This way, her memory lives on," Tommy nodded, unable to speak. He reached out tentatively and touched the baby's tiny hand. Catherine's fingers closed around his, and Tommy let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "She likes me," he said in wonder. "Of course she does," Joe said. "You're her big brother." Marcus pulled them all close, Joe in the bed holding Catherine, Tommy kneeling beside them, himself standing guard over all of them. He picked up his slate and wrote, "My family. My whole world." The first year of Catherine's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and endless wonder. She was a good baby, happy and healthy, with her father's dark hair and her mother's round cheeks. Tommy was devoted to her, insisting on helping with everything from diaper changes to bath time. He sang to her the songs Joe had taught him, read her stories even though she was too young to understand, and showed her off to anyone who visited the ranch. The town's attitude toward the Dawsons had shifted completely. They were no longer the scandal, the mail-order bride who'd been rejected and the scarred mute rancher who'd taken her in. They were a success story, a family who'd overcome adversity and built something beautiful. Other outcasts and misfits began to find their way to the Dawson ranch, knowing they'd find acceptance there. Joe took in sewing work from women who couldn't afford the fancy seamstresses in town. Marcus hired ranch hands that other ranchers wouldn't touch, men with checkered pasts or physical limitations. And slowly, their little community grew. On Catherine's first birthday, they threw a party that half the county attended. The house and yard were full of people, neighbors, friends, even some folks from town who'd once looked down on them. Mrs. Hartley brought a cake. Dr. Hayes and his wife brought toys. Pastor Henderson blessed the baby and the family, declaring them proof that God worked in mysterious ways. As the sun set and guests began to leave, Joe stood on the porch with Catherine in her arms, watching Marcus and Tommy play with the other children in the yard. Marcus was teaching them how to rope fence posts, his movements fluid despite his limp. Tommy was demonstrating his new skill at the piano, having finally mastered a complicated piece Joe had been working on with him. "You've built something special here," Pastor Henderson said, coming to stand beside her. "We all built it," Joe corrected. "Marcus gave me a chance when no one else would. Tommy taught me what it meant to be needed. Catherine showed me I could be more than the world told me I was." "And what did you give them?" Joe thought about that. "Hope, I think. The belief that broken things could be mended. That there was life after loss. That love came in unexpected forms." Henderson smiled. "You know, when you first arrived in Bitter Creek, covered in mud and crying in the street, I thought you were the most pitiful creature I'd ever seen. I was wrong. You were the bravest." "I didn't feel brave." "Courage isn't the absence of fear, Joe. It's moving forward despite it. You did that. You kept moving forward when the world told you to give up. And look what you created." Joe looked out at her family, her home, her life, and felt a peace settle over her that she'd never known in her younger years. This wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd answered Theodore's advertisement. It was better. It was real and messy and sometimes hard, but it was hers. They were hers. Marcus looked up and caught her watching. Even across the distance, she could see his expression soften. He said something to Tommy, then walked toward the porch, his uneven gait as familiar to her now as her own heartbeat. When he reached her, he took Catherine from her arms and held the sleeping baby against his shoulder with practiced ease. With his free hand, he pulled out his slate and wrote, "Happy, happier than I ever thought possible," Joe said honestly. "Good." He erased the slate and wrote again, "Because I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you stay that way." Joe stood on her toes and kissed him, tasting sun and dust and home. "I love you, Marcus Dawson." He couldn't say the words back, but he didn't need to. She saw it in his eyes, felt it in the way he held her and their daughter, knew it in the life they'd built together from nothing but hope and stubbornness and love. That night, after Catherine had been put to bed and Tommy had finally fallen asleep mid-sentence while Joe read to him, Marcus and Joe sat on the porch in the rocking chairs he'd made, one for her, one for him, side by side. The stars were bright overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. "Do you ever think about that day?" Joe asked. "The day you found me in the mud," Marcus nodded and wrote, "Best day of my life, really. Not our wedding day. Or when Catherine was born, those were wonderful. But that day was the day everything changed. The day I started believing in second chances." Joe reached over and took his hand. "I was so angry that day. So hurt and humiliated. I thought my life was over. I thought being rejected by Theodore was the worst thing that could happen to me." Marcus squeezed her hand and wrote, "It was the best thing. Because it brought you to me. Do you think we would have found each other if things had been different? If Theodore had accepted me, or if I'd gone back to Ohio, or if you hadn't been at the general store that day?" "No," Marcus wrote without hesitation. "We were meant to find each other exactly as we did. Broken pieces that fit together perfectly." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, just holding hands and watching the stars. Inside the house, they could hear Catherine make small sleeping sounds and Tommy turn over in his bed. These were the sounds of their life now, small and domestic and infinitely precious. "Marcus," Joe said softly. "Thank you." He looked at her questioningly, "For seeing me. For seeing past what everyone else saw to who I really was. For giving me a chance when the world said I wasn't worth one. For loving me exactly as I am." Marcus set down his slate and pulled her from her rocking chair into his lap. He held her close, his scarred face pressed against her hair, his arms wrapped securely around her waist. And though he couldn't speak the words, Joe felt them in every beat of his heart, every breath he took, every gentle touch. She had been rejected, humiliated, left with nothing in a strange town. She'd been told her whole life that she was too much or not enough, that her body was wrong, that no one would ever truly want her. But Marcus had looked at her and seen strength. He'd looked at her and seen beauty. He'd looked at her and seen home, and she'd looked at him, scarred and silent and broken in his own ways, and seen the same things reflected back at her. They had built this life together from the ashes of their old ones. They had created a family from loneliness and loss. They had proven that the world's judgment didn't define them, that love could bloom in unexpected places, that second chances were real. As Joe sat in her husband's arms on the porch of their home, listening to their children sleep and watching the stars wheel overhead, she thought about that young woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach all those months ago. That woman who'd stood in the mud while strangers laughed. Who'd thought her life was ending. If she could go back and tell that woman what was waiting for her, the love, the family, the home, the acceptance, would she believe it? Probably not. That woman had been too beaten down by life to imagine happiness like this existed, but it did exist. It was real. It was here, in this moment, in this place, with these people, and it was hers. "I love you," she whispered into Marcus's chest. "I love you and Tommy and Catherine and this life we've built. I love all of it." Marcus squeezed her 3 times in response, then 4 times, then kept holding her as the night deepened and the stars shone down on their little ranch in the Wyoming territory. Where a rejected mail-order bride and a scarred, silent rancher had found something the world said they didn't deserve, they'd found each other. And that made all the difference.